This story begins one fine, warm day. There was a girl dancing in the palace, and quite a few guests were gathered around. But then suddenly Mrs. Inu began to pass by the guests, and they noticed her hand. She had a weapon in her hand, and it was covered in blood. The girls started to get very worried about it and even started screaming. The maids who were standing on the sides followed her in order to help her in case of emergency. But the girl named Inu didn't stop. She kept walking. Even though there was also a trail of blood behind her, the maids said they should call a doctor, and one of them went to fulfill that request. The girl walked with a perfectly confident look to her husband's room, and when she entered it, she saw him sitting on his couch with a rather sad expression on his face. But as soon as the man saw her, he said she finally deigned to wish her husband a happy birthday. Inu didn't reply anything to that because of her extreme fatigue and blood loss. She even had bruises forming under her eyes. She basically didn't look very healthy. Her husband reached up and told her to toss the dangerous toy aside. He was referring to the weapon she held in her hands, very strongly. However, Inu came closer to him and said that there was something else she had to do. Her voice was very angry. However, the man paid no attention to this and said that she would probably try to kill him again. But of course, she would never succeed. He smiled and also said that she had already failed once, so she would probably fail this time too. The servants who were standing on the sides supporting the master laughed. However, Inu didn't stop. She was so angry that she clenched that sword even harder. Because of this, the blood flowed more and more, and the wound became deeper. The girl suddenly stopped and looked him straight in the eye, and told him that it would have been much better if he had just killed her. She would want her own death, not her innocent family. He would rather kill her and give her to his dear crows, whom he loves so much. At this point, the man continued to smile and, getting up from his seat, told her not to say such words. He stepped closer to her and asked her how on earth he could take the life of someone he loved. Yena was incredibly surprised when she heard those words, but then suddenly she also smiled evilly and asked if he really thought it was love. The girl was so exhausted that she could barely stand on her feet. When she tried to approach him, she started to stagger from side to side. She called him a sick man and said there was no love after all he had done. She couldn't stand it and started screaming. The girl was hysterical, her tears were flowing, and she asked him how he could even talk about love after all he had done. He took and brutally took the lives of the people she cared for, and then he nailed their heads to the gates of the fortress. After such atrocities, she doesn't understand how he dares even think of any love towards her. She continued to scream and said that he took and killed a man just because he looked into her eyes, and took the body and branded it with his name, as if she was a thing that belonged only to him. Gina was already beginning to calm down a bit, and said in a quiet voice, smiling, that this must really be love for him. The man completely disregarded her hysterics and, smiling, said she had gotten it right. It was his expression of love. The girl, when she heard this, became even more upset. Her face turned cold, back to stone, and the imprint of her husband's name was visible on her chest. He didn't take his eyes off her the whole time and said she belonged only to him. The man also added that she, in a form herself, said that she is fully branded with his name, so there can't even be any discussion about it. Gina at this point began to remember how much it hurt to endure these humiliations, and how cruel it had been to her to have the seals of her name placed on her by fire. However, the man, smiling, said that she was now his property, that is, Hejo's property. When the girl couldn't stand it, she started plugging her ears with her hands and screaming loudly, talking about how she was not his. Her whole body was shaking, and she was waving her head from side to side, telling him she didn't belong to him. However, Hejo moved closer to her and took the weapon from the girl, saying that she was his. Gina looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he wanted to do, but the man, in turn, kissed her bloody hand along with the blade, and said she would be his until the end of the ages. The fact that he was squeezing her hand hard made the girl bleed even more. She struggled to get his hands off hers and gasped in pain. Gina looked at her husband and said that he is just a sick man, and she herself does not understand why she got involved with such a lunatic, that in her previous life and in this one, nothing her mistakes do not teach her. When the man heard this, he didn't understand it at first, but then he looked at the girl more closely and became very wary. And all because she presented that blade right to her throat and had even already started to incise it, that a few drops of blood dripped from there. He was frightened, but at the same time he tried to remain indifferent. The man reached forward and asked her to give him the sword. However, Yenna was completely calm, as for someone about to commit suicide. She smiled and said that she would never be his, and she is even willing to part with her life of her own free will, not under his whim or command. And so, without thinking long, in the same second she put a little more effort into it and slit her throat. Blood was gushing and she had already fallen breathless to the ground. It was on his birthday that the sky spilled blue in the underworld where darkness reigns. Except in the girl's opinion, he certainly doesn't deserve it. So she gave him the holiday he deserves. The man, when he saw that she was dead, ran up to her and took her dead body in his arms, while she was at that moment joyfully wishing Heijo a happy birthday. At that moment the man was incredibly angry. He turned to the servants, who were already surrounding them on all sides, and asked them to call the physician at once. In fact, she mentally wished him for the rest of his life to suffer on this day as much as he had trampled her for the rest of her life. However, before she completely died, the girl looked somewhere in the distance with a completely blank stare. She saw a strange man among the crowd of people. She didn't realize who it was, but when she looked more closely, she noticed that the stranger was even crying. It surprised her that he could be crying over her death. She really wished the man wouldn't look at her like that, because she had accomplished just the perfect revenge on her horrible husband. With these thoughts, she closed her eyes from which tears flowed. But actually, Gina really wanted to enjoy this beautiful death with a sense of contentment. In fact, after her eyes closed, the girl felt as if she were underwater. She mentally turned to the god of the underworld, Tamya, and did not know why he was making her live one terrible life after another. This time, however, she really wants him to not give her any more chances. She doesn't want to live. She really wants God to let her just walk away, just like that, with dignity and pride. She begged him not to send her to the big world where Heijo existed. But not long after that, she suddenly opened her eyes and realized that she had come back to life. The girl was very dizzy for a while and was trying to figure out what was going on and where she was. Then she suddenly turned around and was terrified. Ino quickly stood up and got out of the big red car, which was for some reason deep in the woods. The girl even fell to the ground out of desperation. She was annoyed at how much she already knew the area perfectly. So she began to cry loudly and beat her hands on the ground, not understanding why she was back in the same world with the same horrible man. But then suddenly after a while she heard some strange sound. It was more like hooves from a horse. Ino was immediately wary and couldn't believe that Heijo had already appeared. But she realized herself that she needed to run away from this place as soon as possible. She of course understood this perfectly well, but here suddenly she couldn't even get up from the ground, for there was simply no strength left in her legs. The sounds got louder and louder. She tried to get up, but she couldn't. Suddenly she heard an unfamiliar voice asking her to stop. Gina was very surprised. It was not her husband's voice, after all. She turned around in tears to see who it was. At that moment, a man who was wearing an unbuttoned shirt ran up to the girl. He stopped in front of her and said something about people from the surface of the earth. Gina didn't answer anything to that. She was still sitting on the ground, unable to get up, staring at the stranger in surprise. When the girl saw him, she realized that everything was not the same as it had been in her previous life. At this very time, in this very place, Heijo appeared. But then suddenly she heard the car door open and a man's voice asked, "Is everyone alive in there?" The girl immediately turned in that direction to see if her guess was correct. So when she looked to the side, she saw her father helping his daughter out of the car. Gina's sister, a girl named Sao, was holding her head, but said she was fine. And so when the girl looked at them, she couldn't believe her eyes, because her mom also came out of the car, absolutely alive. Tears came to her eyes as she realized that her entire family was still alive for now, which surprised her even more. Suddenly a stranger from the forest, from his horse, addressed her whole family. He said that they must have had some kind of accident. He smiled happily at them and asked if they were hurt. The man was truly beautiful, The girl's father was briefly confused, and her sister couldn't take her eyes off this stranger, but the man replied that they were fine. At that moment, he heard Sue's voice, who turned to him and asked him why he was dressed like that, and suggested that perhaps there was a drama being filmed nearby. Gina, in turn, just continued to sit in silence and didn't even try to understand what was going on, because I guess she wouldn't understand anything anyway. The girl's father came closer to the man and apologized, asking if he could lend them his phone, since theirs had apparently been broken during the accident. But when the stranger heard this, he continued to smile. However, he said that he didn't understand at all what they were talking about, but he thought he could help them. He turned to his assistant, who was standing nearby, and asked that he take these men and introduce them to Mr. Changgong. The girl, when she heard this, was horrified. She didn't want to come to Changgong, the ruler of the underworld, all because he is also Heijo's father, which means that if they go to see him like nothing happened, she will meet the man after all. At that moment, many black crows began to fly over them, and as the girl looked at them, she thought that there was still a little hope that he himself was on his way here, and so they might not cross paths at that place. But when she saw a flock of wild crows, she realized that it was dangerous to be in that place too. So she had to run away. Gina knew very well that she had to get out of this place as soon as possible for her own good. But she didn't know where she could go, for danger awaited her everywhere. Suddenly the girl heard her sister Sao speaking to her. She was very happy and smiled, saying that they would be helped now. She motioned for her sister to get up, but then she suddenly became alert as something strange began to happen. So looked at her sister and noticed that her hair had suddenly begun to lighten. When she said this, the girl herself was very surprised. She saw that the tips of her hair had actually gotten lighter colors. She immediately ran closer to her and started screaming, asking how this could even happen. Gina was incredibly surprised and said that she didn't understand what was happening or why her hair was suddenly very light. But then suddenly, the stranger came closer to them and said in a quiet voice that they were just amazing girls. Immediately they looked at him, and they were incredibly frightened, because they did not understand why all this was happening. He said it was the first time he'd ever seen his hair so shiny, so he told the girl while continuing to smile that they should go along with him after all. Gina was still having a hard time recovering normally after the accident, and when she heard his advice, she asked, "Does he really think so?" Then her father intervened in their conversation. He asked why he had suddenly decided to take only her eldest daughter. This frightened him, because he realized how cruel the world was, and that something very bad could happen to his daughter. He smiled at the man and told him not to worry, because after meeting Mr. Changgong, they would see each other again. But her father was incredibly angry. He suddenly began to shout and asked why on earth he should trust him with a complete stranger. Ina was sitting perfectly still at this moment. She realized that if nothing was done to her now, she would definitely face Heiju. And if it did happen, it wouldn't end well. The girl's mind suddenly flashed back to her past lives, when she had found herself in this place, and at the same time, Heijo had come, and of course he hadn't killed her, but he had brutally murdered her whole family. Now she felt like they were talking to her, blaming her for everything, but it was incredibly hard for the girl to relive it all. He had done it very cruelly, and made her watch and listen to them die. She remembered the faces of her dead parents, who looked pitifully at their daughter and began to accuse her of knowing full well that this man would do this. But she'd let him kill them anyway. The girl was feeling very bad now. The memories consumed her, but for a while she came to her senses and just kept quiet while her father fought with the stranger. Well, after a while she quietly said that she had agreed to go along with him. Her father and sister were immediately surprised when they heard this, and did not understand why she had really agreed to it. The stranger said nothing to this. He only watched the girl's reaction intently. She, in turn, was incredibly serious. So turned to her sister and asked if she was sure she wanted to do it. Her father was desperate and asked her to listen to her sister, because it might be too dangerous. But in reality, Ina herself didn't even know if it was the right choice. But in order to avoid meeting Heijo right now, she has no other choice. She has to accept this dubious proposal. Then suddenly their mother intervened in their conversation and came closer to them and said that the girl should decide for herself. They immediately turned in her direction and looked at the woman in surprise, and the woman in turn came closer and closer to them and asked her family when Gina had ever listened to them, for she always does things her way. Her mom was very stern and said the girl doesn't even realize how much they care about her and is forever doing things the way she thinks they should be done, even if it's wrong. Her husband started to move closer to her and looked at her in surprise, not understanding why she was saying these things. However, Gina turned to her mother and told her that that was not the case at all, but the woman was not going to listen to her. She turned around and started to walk away. The girl's mom told her not to make excuses because she wasn't going to pry into her soul, and she was old enough to do what she thought was right. After that, she turned to her family and said that they should go now. Gina's sister and father immediately followed her. The man asked his wife if she was serious about leaving her own daughter like this, with who knows who. They were all incredibly surprised by this decision of their mother, but she in turn did not want to explain anything more to them, and walked all the time in silence. Gina mentally apologized to her mother, thinking about the fact that she couldn't explain everything to her this time. But now she was serious about protecting them. When her family had gotten far enough away, the girl turned to the stranger who was already standing waiting for her. He sat down across from her and said that she was an incredibly strange woman. In fact, he said it with either mockery or admiration. It wasn't clear from his tone what he meant. But then suddenly, the stranger himself smiled contentedly and said that staying with him in this situation was clearly not an easy decision for her, especially since her family was against it. Gina didn't answer anything to that. She only looked at him silently. She wasn't really doing it for him, but for herself and her family. The girl held out her hand to him and told him she understood that he wanted to talk to her about something in private, and it concerned her too. The man continued to just stand there and stare at her. Then she wondered if he would take her hand. Guy was still thinking about her, and then smiling, he kissed her hand and told her that it was a big part of holding the hand of a beautiful woman like her. Especially in an underworld devoid of any light. It's incredible luck that he met her. Gina didn't answer anything. Then he helped her up and asked her what she had to say to him. The girl was actually incredibly scared, and she didn't know how to tell him about it, but she began to mentally support herself and told herself that she could do anything. She actually fell into the underworld after an accident, and after each death the girl returned to this very place, at this very time, and this is currently her third life in the underworld. Now the girl deliberately uses absolutely everything she learned in her torturous second life, and no longer makes the same mistakes as she did before. She suddenly clenched the man's hand even tighter and pulled him closer, thinking of Hejo. She was angry, but she was going to be free of him and never depend on him again. So the girl looked determinedly at the stranger and asked him to make her his. When the man heard this, he was very surprised. He began to scrutinize the girl, whose hands were trembling and who was incredibly frightened, but tried to keep her face calm. After a while of silence, he asked if she was seriously now proposing to a complete stranger to make her his, and wondered if she even knew what that meant at all. Gina, more than anyone else, knew what that even meant. So she replied that she was well aware of all the risks, and that was why she was offering. After living 2 consecutive lives in the underworld, she realized a few simple truths. The first is that once in this world, you can't go back to your old life, and that there was no way to avoid meeting Hejo. No matter how many times she tried to run away or hide, she'd meet him sooner or later, and those meetings never ended well. And now she was determined not to live that horrible life again. She would rather be the woman of some strange man than go back to that awful husband. Gina gathered her courage and determination and said that she wanted very much to become his woman. The stranger was incredibly surprised by the girl's decision and remained silent for a while, pondering her words. But afterward he smiled and, tucking her hair behind her ear, said that her confession seemed very sad to him for some reason. He wondered who in the world would offer themselves to a man with a droopy look like hers. But the girl was so upset and frightened that she only looked away from him and said nothing. Then the stranger, seeing that she was not going to go for communication, said that she was curious enough for him too. However, he does not take strange women to his place, so he has to refuse her offer. Gina suddenly couldn't take it anymore and started screaming. She asked him to take her in. The man didn't understand why she wanted it so much, and she continued her speech and said that usually when lost people are found, they ask if they are hurt and try to send them home. However, he immediately wanted to introduce her kin to a man named Changgong, which means that such is the law of this place. The girl looked him in the eye and wondered if she was correct in assuming. However, without waiting for an answer, she said that she had been asked to go along with him, breaking this very important rule. The stranger smiled and said that her request didn't seem so simple to him after all. She told him well, and he in turn added that he apologized to her in that case, but still could not accept the offer. Gina was incredibly angry with him about this, and was about ready to scream, when suddenly he put her on a horse and offered her some kind of deal. He said he'd already talked about not bringing strangers into his home, and he wasn't naive enough to believe that she genuinely wanted to be his woman. He held her so that the girl would not dismount from her horse, and asked that she answer him honestly what she wanted from him. He smiled and said he really wanted to know what had prompted her to make a false declaration of love. Gina didn't answer him to that right away. She thought about what she really wanted to be near her mom and dad and her little sister, to be safe and alive. The girl suddenly moved closer to him and said that no matter what, she wanted him to protect her. The man just stared at her for a while. Then, with a smile, he said that he agreed after all. Then he jumped on the horse and ordered it to go. While they were on their way, the stranger turned to the girl and said that, come to think of it, they hadn't even introduced each other. Jovita said his name, and then asked what her name was. The girl, without even turning around, introduced herself. She closed her eyes and began to breathe in the fresh morning air. She thought about the fact that for the first time in a very long time, she was walking so freely in the open air. The man in turn turned to the book and, repeating her name, said it was very beautiful, and he had never heard such a thing before. Some more time passed from then on, and they finally stopped at some unknown place to Gina. The horse stopped just outside the gate, and the man said it was the gate building of the fortress. He spoke quietly enough, but she heard him say that her hair was too conspicuous, so it would be better to go quietly through the back door so no one would notice them. When he saw her surprised face, he followed her gaze and saw that she was looking directly at the flowers that were growing under the road. The man wondered if it was the first time she had seen them. Gina only nodded her head in response. Then Jovita explained that they were flowers that bloomed only in the dungeon. This place was in total darkness, and the sky was always black as coal, and the only source of light was the lava puddle burning not far from here. The ash that flies out of the lava is the fertilizer that these flowers use, so they can exist in this kind of habitat. Gina had been a little surprised by this story about gardening, but now it made more sense. She took her head to the side, and the girl was overwhelmed by memories from a past life associated with these flowers. One day when she was already together with Heicho, the man picked these flowers and gave them to her. He said that these flowers were as incredibly beautiful as she was. At that moment, the girl was incredibly happy, because no one had ever shown her so much attention or complimented her so much before. Gina quickly dismissed those memories. They were too heavy for her. She even put her head down and frowned because of her sadness. The man noticed it, but said nothing. She thought about the fact that she was back in this universe again, and that made her even more upset. Then, without thinking long, they went inside, just through the back door, just as Vita had told her. As they drove, the girl thought only of the fact that she would have to live her life again in this horrible and unbearable place. As soon as they entered the castle grounds, some girl suddenly approached them from behind. She turned to the gentleman and said that she had been waiting for him all this time. Gina realized at first, without turning around, who the voice belonged to. She recognized it from the start. The girl who came closer to them bowed and introduced herself to their new guest, saying her name was Sarim. The servant girl came closer to them and told her mistress that she would serve her. Gina recognized her. At that moment, the girl remembered how in her past life, when she had felt incredibly bad, the maid had been nearby and tried to help her in some way. Sarim talked about how a girl could be unafraid and say if she was having a hard time. She smiled and said that she would always be on her side. She was always ready to come to mistress's aid even in the most difficult of situations. And now that Gina saw her again, she thought it was incredibly good to see her again. The man helped the girl off the horse, and the servant said that they took the lady's family to a comfortable place so that they could rest a little after the situation had happened. As the girl started to get closer to her, she suddenly thought about the fact that this maid, Sarima, was Heijo's person. Yena was just horrified and didn't understand why this girl was in this place since she was serving another person. Havita brought her closer to the maid and asked that Sarima take the mistress and dye her hair any color she wanted, as long as it wasn't so bright and conspicuous. Gina was a little intimidated by the man's insistence on helping her. He ran his hand through her hair and asked her to bathe and change into cleaner clothes after painting. He put his arm around her and told her to send her to his bedroom after she was done with all the chores. Gina heard this and looked at the man in surprise, not believing he meant it. However, Havita kept smiling and said that they would spend the night together, so a separate bedroom could be prepared for him by the maid. As the man stepped aside, Rome turned to her and told her mistress to follow her. The girl had a friendly smile, but Yena still eyed her warily and didn't trust her. Soon they came to a small house, and the maid said that this was now the place where she would live. She turned, smiled at Yena, and told her to make herself at home. The girl tried to smile back and thanked her for the wire. However, Gina also told the maid that she wished Sarim didn't call her mistress and could address her as you in a less formal manner. She also said that the maid must have misunderstood everything, because she and Havita are not in any special relationship. Gina wanted to say that that wasn't what Havita meant when he talked about them sleeping together. But Sarim stepped closer to her and said that there was no way she would do that. Sarim explained that first of all, Havita had called her mistress herself, and she could not disrespectfully address a person whom her master respected. Yes. And in general, Sarim had said that this was the first time Havita had brought a woman into the house, and Jaina had been very surprised to hear that. She looked at the maid and asked, "Is this really the first time he's done this?" She in turn confirmed this information. The girl at that moment remembered how he had openly flirted with her, and even kissed her hand in greeting, and thought about how he didn't look at all as modest as he wanted to appear. The maid wanted to say something else, but then she changed her mind. She suddenly became very sad and turned around and started to leave. The girl explained that this information was not something that could be shared, but what she can say for sure is that she means a lot to Mr. Sweat. After all, he certainly didn't bring her to him for nothing. When Gina heard those words, she was very surprised. She couldn't even guess what it would really mean to him. After all, they had only just met. They walked the rest of the way to the room in silence, and the girl decided to ask the maid a few more questions. She stopped and asked, "What is Mr. Huita really like?" Sarim thought for a while. Then she asked the girl, "Do you know anything about guardian spirits?" The girl was a little wary when she heard these words, and replied that it was the first time she had heard of such a thing. The maid said that since this was the first time she was hearing about them, she would tell her everything. In this place, all the people who were born and grew up are inhabited by various animal spirits. The locals call them guardian spirits. They come in a variety of forms. They can be as weak hares and sparrows, or as tigers who dominate all animals. In an emergency situation, a person can reincarnate exactly into their guardian spirit. And the stronger the spirit that enters a person, the more powerful it is considered to be. When Gina heard this, she began to slowly process all the information she had heard, because she had to pretend that this was the first time she had heard about it, even though she already knew about it. At the moment, the strongest people in the underworld are its king, Changgong, who has a tiger guardian spirit, and the one the brown bear spoke of, namely Heijo, is also very powerful. The maid said after a while that Mr. Huit's guardian spirit was a black wolf, and that's why people very often call him that, because in fact, even his appearance perfectly fits this nickname. When Yena heard that, she wondered, they had actually moved on, and she realized that this spirit was perfect for this man. When they got inside, the maid immediately prepared a hot bath for the girl. Gina didn't hesitate long, but climbed into it to rest and regain her strength. The maid immediately went after her and began slowly brushing her hair. She also asked what color to dye her hair. She also said that any shade would look good with her fair skin, but they would still be better off picking darker ones like the gentleman said. Sarim asked what she thought of the black color. It would look the same as the Lord's. Gina caught a glimpse of the maid and noticed that she was enthusiastic enough, but as the girl remembered, she hadn't been quite so sociable before. She is, of course, very glad to have her, but the other socializing makes her seem quite alien to her. The maid, for her part, said that no matter what happened, she would always be at her side. But still the girl sighed heavily and thought about the fact that it was still the same Sarim, and she really wanted to believe her. A lot of things changed in this life for the girl, and where she was supposed to meet Hajo, Hivita appeared. And besides, the maid was not in Hajo's fortress, but in Huit's house, where she'd met her. But as for her hair, she didn't understand why it had suddenly changed to such a light color. At that moment, the maid had already started to dye the ends of her hair, and Gina touched one of them. The maid immediately told her that she would get her hands dirty, so she had better not touch it until the dye was completely washed off. The girl sighed heavily and thought about the fact that all these changes seemed to hint to her that this life would be very different from the previous two. So too, at least this time, there is not much at all that she can hope for any improvement. Sarim continued to dye her hair as she suddenly became very worried and turned to her mistress and asked her what to do. She said she persistently scrubbed her hair with black dye and it just stopped shining, but the color still doesn't overlap. It still stays that silvery color. Gina smiled back at her and said that she thought it was enough that they were at least just out of sight, but the maid was still very concerned and said that they had finally gotten the result they wanted. Sarim sighed heavily and said that she wanted Mistress to have the same hair as Huitsan, didn't she? When the girl heard these words, she realized that the maid had meant to do it. She decided to calm her down and said that there was nothing to be done, because the paint would probably not take. But she liked the color, so she thanked her for the work she had done. Sarim sighed heavily and said that since that was the case, she would leave her alone so the girl could rest and gather her strength. When the maid was out the door, Gina was left alone. She began to enjoy the hot water running down her body and was ready to stay in that tub for a long time. She also thought about all the things that had happened to her before and the life she had now, and realized that it meant something after all. So it's really good for her. The girl also recalled her conversations with Huita, who asked her to tell him honestly what she wanted, for he wanted to know what had prompted her to utter a false confession. He certainly said he wanted to offer her a deal. However, she still hadn't heard exactly what he was trying to accomplish. This man was not really in favor of making a deal with her. Gina closed her eyes and sighed heavily, thinking that if, like Sarim had said, she was special and human to this man, it was possible he could protect her and her family after all. It had been quite some time since then. The water in the bathtub had already cooled, and moonlight was creeping into her room. The girl finally finished her bath, and, wrapped in her robe, she wrung out her hair, the ends of which were dark after all. As she was about to leave the bath, she heard a man's voice behind her. It was Mr. Hivita. He leaned against the wall and asked if she had finished. The girl straight up froze in place. She had not expected to see him right now, and he, in turn smiling, said that he had heard that a woman gathered much more time than a man, and if it was really true, then his expectation was justified. Yena, who was still holding on to her hair the whole time, immediately turned around, and seeing him, she was very surprised. She even blushed with embarrassment. The girl came closer to him and asked indignantly how he dared to come here at all. Vida unbuttoned his robe and told her not to be so angry with him. He put his hand on the wall behind her, and as he drew nearer, he said that it was she who had suggested that he should make her his. Hivita looked her straight in the eyes and said with a smile on her face, she had said those words out loud herself. So also the first one, he hadn't forced her to do anything. Gina was outraged at the short distance between them and tried to shove her off, saying that he had said he didn't take strange women to his place. The man did not deny it, and said that he did. Well, then he suddenly added that he had only come to discuss with her detailed deal they were making. He said that while she was in the bathroom, he remembered that he hadn't told her about his part. Huita cut to the chase and added that he had accepted her terms, so she would have to accept his too. It was after she listened and agreed to his terms that the contract could be considered concluded. The girl was a little frightened, because she did not know what to expect from him, but she said that she also wanted him to state his terms. Then she inquired as to what exactly he wanted. Vita kept smiling and said that it would actually be very simple. The girl was actually incredibly worried. Her heart was beating very hard, and he looked her straight in the eye and said that he would like her to be his bride. When he said those words, he moved even closer to her, so that their lips almost touched. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She lowered her head down and said that he was very vague. One day he would set one condition and the next he would say something completely different. Yenna sighed heavily and asked if he was just playing with her. When the man heard that, he was incredibly surprised and asked what she meant by that. She felt incredibly bad about her experiences. She said it was ridiculous that a woman he was seeing for the first time had asked to possess him, and when she offered, he had refused immediately, playing up his nobility to her. And now he has the courage to say that he wants her to be his bride. Huida was himself very surprised to hear her say such words. He squeezed his hand even tighter. The girl was shaking with fear, for he had no idea what had been going through her mind when she'd suggested it. Evita just stared at her for a while. After that, he tucked his hair behind his ear and apologized. He smiled and said that he hadn't explained, and that's why she had misunderstood everything now. He also apologized for not considering her feelings. Evita said she must have had a good reason for offering herself to the first person she met, and he actually had the same. He explained to the girl that he wasn't fooling her, and certainly didn't intend to play with her in any way. He took all his hands off her and stepped back, asking if she would give him a chance to justify himself. They went out into the room where the maid made them tea. Then the man began his story, saying that she was absolutely right, for Chatgon was not an easy person to deal with. Kita said that this person was the king of the underworld and had the largest guardian spirit, and now his regalia is claimed by as many as 2 successors who want to take his place. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised, for he had only one son, namely Hejo. The man continued his story by saying that the man named Hajo is the son and direct heir of the king, and the second successor is himself. Vita is a distant relative of Changon but can also claim a legacy. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She didn't expect him to be a relative of Changoni's. Well, the man said that he is constantly receiving various threats from Hejo. For as long as he exists, he is a hindrance to his ascension to the throne, and to demonstrate that he has no interest at all in the inheritance process, he needs a woman far removed from power. He looked at Gina and said with a smile on his face that she was just in time to show up. That is exactly what his side of the contract is. The girl was still trying to take in this information she had just heard, and he in turn wondered what she would say about it. He asked with a smile on his face if she would be his fake bride, but seeing that she was still anxious, Vita told her to come to his chambers when she was ready to accept the proposal. After that, the man walked away, leaving the girl alone with her musings, and Gina as it occurred to her that she would be a fake bride. From that moment some time passed, and the girl was changed into a special national outfit, and she did come to the master's bedroom. The maid knocked on his door and told him that his mistress had come to see him. In fact, in her past life, the girl had never heard of Chonggong's distant relative, and she can't know how close to the truth it is at all. However, she still has no other choice. Then Huit's voice was heard to say that she could come in. The door opened, and a beautiful girl appeared on the threshold. The man immediately approached her. He had also changed into normal clothes. He was already half naked in his robe, and seeing the girl on the doorstep, smiled. Gina was thinking at this moment that all the details were not that important. However, his status in the house was a problem. She would use absolutely everything she could, and for her own well-being. She's going to use him just as this man will use her for his own purposes, so she doesn't feel somehow uncomfortable about it. The girl stepped inside, at which point the man smiled, said she had a fairly confident look about her, and asked if she had already made a decision on their matter. Gina actually looked quite determined and said that she had already made up her mind. She stepped closer to him and said in a confident voice that she would be his bride by contract. Evita smiled and said that in that case their deal was done. He held out his hand somewhere to the side, pointing to the bed, and said she could sit down. The girl was not very comfortable about it. However, she walked forward and sat down on the bed. The man leaned closer to her. and said that in the eyes of others they must appear to be a couple who had fallen terribly in love at first sight. He leaned lower and lower and said he was going to kiss her neck, looking her straight in the eyes, asking if she would let him do it. Gina said nothing aloud but only suggested with her head. He touched her earrings with his hand and said that he had told the maid not to take them, but that she had forgotten. The man put his arm around her waist and came closer and closer. The girl turned away from him, but suddenly a terrible memory from her past life came over her. She remembered Hejo forcibly holding her in various places and asking her to remember that only he was allowed to kiss her. Vita, in turn, paid no attention to her and began to kiss her gently on the neck. The girl, who was haunted by all these horrible memories, was horrified and uncomfortable. She suddenly started screaming and waving her arms, asking him to let go and move away from her. Inu threw him aside. The man looked at her in surprise, not understanding what had happened. She'd given her consent before, and everything was fine, but suddenly she was screaming and shoving with her hands. He stepped closer to her and held her hands to calm her down, and she brushed him aside and asked him to get his hands off her right now. Inu was so overwhelmed by her grief and emotions that she couldn't stand it and fainted, falling to the ground. However, she was lucky that Huita continued to stay by her side and picked her up so that she would not fall to the ground. The man looked at her tired face and sighed heavily, thinking about the fact that she was an incredibly unpredictable person, and he didn't know what was even on her mind. In fact, the moment the girl screamed, the maid who was sitting next to her heard it just in case, and immediately became worried. The two maids who were next to Sarim began to whisper, saying that it must have been the mistress screaming. They didn't know what had happened, or if they were all right. Sarim became very worried, so she decided to intervene in this situation. She immediately got up from the floor and started walking into this room. The maids who were sitting nearby were very surprised at this free behavior. The maid began to whisper to her, telling her that this was not allowed. After all, if Huida-san found out that they had been eavesdropping, they would be in trouble. However, the maid replied that everything would be fine, and she would only open the door a little to see if everything was all right. And the moment Sarim was about to open the door a little, she didn't have time to do anything because the Lord opened the door and the girl fell straight to the ground. The man looked at her in surprise and wondered what she was doing. The other maid, who had stopped Sarim from doing this, was very frightened, for she knew they would be punished. When the maids answered nothing to his question, Vita said for Sarim to stay, and everyone else could be free. The maids bowed and immediately began to leave, and the master looked at her angrily and said that he had, after all, ordered her to wait for his instructions, and he did not remember giving permission to eavesdrop on their conversation with Inu. Sarim in turn got to her feet, and felt incredibly embarrassed by her behavior. Then she said she was just worried that he might need something on such an important night. She smiled awkwardly, and said that she just wanted to be genuinely helpful to him. In fact, the girl had to make up some normal excuse, so that he would believe her and not scold her. Vita looked at the girl carefully and said that she had a very good tongue and could certainly talk. Suddenly he became more serious and said that it was not worth it, because it was all for the best. Such an expected night for her did not happen. Sarim was incredibly embarrassed, and she started to scream, saying that she had already taken it. And then now, with a worried look on her face, she asked what had happened. The girl said that everyone who was waiting behind the wall and heard the scream and wondered why the mistress suddenly reacted to it in such a way. The maid looked hopefully at the Lord, but Havita only turned back toward the room and told her to go in and check if everything was all right, since she was so worried. Sarim immediately ran into the room and walked over to Mistress, who was lying peacefully on the bed with tears in her eyes. She exhaled with relief and said that fortunately she had only fainted and nothing serious had happened to her. She began to wipe the tears from Mistress's face and said she thought the girl would sleep for a few hours, and after resting she would wake up. But as soon as Sarim wiped the tears from her face, new ones came. She turned to her master in surprise, asking why she would not stop crying. Havita only shrugged and said in a quiet voice that he hadn't done anything to her, so he himself had no idea. Sarim was incredibly angry, She turned to the master and asked how the man who so tenderly embraced women to order had managed to drive the mistress to such a state. Jovita didn't understand why she was coming on to him so much, and said that he had actually never gently hugged a girl to order, and they were merely playing roles for mutual benefit. The maid's nerves were already at breaking point, and she started screaming, saying that the problem was that the girls themselves didn't think so. They really thought they were in some kind of close relationship. Vita averted his gaze and thought about the fact that the girl had actually been afraid to even look at him as he approached her to begin with. He suddenly realized that Inu had a feeling of disgust, and it was as if she wasn't thinking of him, but of someone else who apparently gave her a not-so-pleasant feeling in memory. But he wondered who she was thinking of then. Sarim sighed heavily at this point, and said that he was turning well with the mistress after all. She was an important person to him, and perhaps she could help him find the peace he wanted. Evita stood by his opinion and said that it really only remains to be seen. And much more importantly, did the maid check if the mark was on mistress's shoulder? Sarim immediately answered that there was some blurry mark there, but she didn't know for sure yet. The maid also said that she had thought she would get a chance to check if he spent the night with her together. But since that had happened to mistress, it would be very difficult to see if everything was okay there for now. Jovita said that he understood now, and added that she could go, and asked that the maid be seated so that no one would know what had happened, and no rumors would spread. Sarim immediately stood up and bowed, and said that everything would be done in the best way possible. When the door closed, the man walked over to mistress, who continued to lie on the bed crying. He just looked at her face for a while, and after that, he also started to wipe the tears from her eyes, realizing that this whole situation was keeping him on edge, and he would definitely need to find out what had happened to her. Several more hours had passed since then, and Inu finally woke up. She was terrified because she had been having horrible dreams about Heijo all this time. She panicked for a while, but then she heard a voice behind her. The voice asked if she was all right, and also asked if she was having a nightmare. Inu immediately turned to the side and saw Huita sitting quietly opposite the window drinking his tea. He looked at her and asked how she was feeling. Without waiting for an answer, he said that last night she had fainted out of the blue, and he was very frightened about it. The girl looked at him in surprise and thought for a while about how to answer him. Then she apologized to him and said that she remembered very badly what had happened the previous evening. However, Huita said that she might not apologize because of that. The man pointed with his hand to the table, which was filled with various foods, and said that her health was more important now. He also added that she must have been hungry all this time, so he suggested that she eat first and then talk. Inu agreed to his proposal, and first she changed into more comfortable clothes. The girl sat down at the table in front of him and began to eat her food, while the man had already finished his meal. Jovita said he wanted to clarify a very important point, and said that she had asked that he protect her, and he had agreed to accept that condition. The girl had been watching and listening to him intently the whole time, but the man also said that in order to protect her, he had to know who and what she was even afraid of. Inu put her head down and thought about what to say to him in response to that question. The image of Heijo popped into her mind at that moment. The girl's hands even began to shake, and she didn't know how much she could even tell this man or how safe it would be. She was still silent for a while. Then in a shaky voice she said that she had a husband. Memories from her past life when she was still with Heijo began to surface. Inu remembered sitting doing something in the garden once. Then she heard him call her, a man, and immediately jumped up, running to meet him. As soon as she hugged him, the man stroked her back and asked what would happen if she fell again when she ran like that. But the girl hugged him happy too, and said he could still catch her, so she didn't care about that. Inu. At this point she thought about the fact that perhaps her once sincerely loved ex-husband did exist. However, at some point things just changed. He looked at the girl and said that she always found arguments that he couldn't disagree with, and at such moments the girl was ready to be in his arms. In fact, in order to talk about her ex-husband, the girl decided to start with a story about her childhood. Their little family circle consisted of a strict mother and an affectionate father, and a serious eldest daughter and a charming youngest. Perhaps from the outside they seemed to be a normal and harmonious family. But next to them, Inu all the time felt somehow alien and tender. When she got a little older and was already in school one day, They had to have a joint lesson with parents, and the class teacher reminded the children about it. The students, when they heard about it, immediately began to shout joyfully, and the teacher asked them not to forget about it and be sure to show Mom and Dad the newsletter. And when the lesson was over, Jenu, who was in this class, looked at the bulletin and was surprised to see that there was an open class with parents, content time, and much more. She had to give this bulletin to her mother, but she didn't know if she could even talk to her about it. After all, they don't have the closest and friendliest relationship. And so, when the girl returned home, in the evening she came to her sister, who at that time was playing in her room and scattered all her toys. She started yelling at her sister. The girl said that her parents were coming soon and she had scattered everything and wondered who should clean up after her little girl. The sister did not fully understand everything and said that the sister should do it. Inu was incredibly angry about this, and she was about to yell at her sister again, when suddenly the doors opened and her parents said they were already back. Her sister immediately ran to meet them and started hugging her mom, while Inu stayed where she was and started to get incredibly worried, because she realized that she was most likely being messed up again by her sister. And her fears were not in vain, for as soon as the mom looked at her older daughter and saw the toys scattered around, she started screaming, asking her daughter what the horror was in the house. Inu put her head down and said that she was going to clean up, however. Sister only scattered everything even more, but the girl didn't even have time to say anything, and her mother came closer to her and said that she was older, and now she was blaming it on the younger one. The woman also said that it was her duty to look after her, which she apparently could not even cope with. Inu was about to object to something. However, her mother interrupted her and asked her what she was telling her. She should set a good example for her younger sister. The woman was annoyed that her daughter was starting to clean up again, so she scolded her again for it. The girl put her head down and apologized to her for that. Mom turned the other way and with a heavy sigh asked if she could clean up the mess before she got out of the shower. Inu sighed heavily and put her head down and said that she understood, and in order not to disappoint her mom even more, she still had to put her little sister's toys away. She started putting away toy after toy and thought about how she expected her mom to react that way. So she also decided it was best not to tell her about the open class. Inu also realized that even if she told her, the woman would not go as she was too busy. And at that moment, she shifted her gaze to the huge bags of various purchases her mother had brought home. The girl sighed heavily and tried to dispel herself, thinking that it would be better not to make her angry and handle it herself. In fact, she was having a hard time keeping her emotions in check and not crying. The next morning, Inu told her mother before going out that she was leaving. The woman came close to her and asked her why she was leaving so early. She looked sternly at the girl and asked if there was anything she wanted to tell her. Inu was immediately alert. She didn't understand what her mother was saying, but she was serious enough. The woman smiled and said that they had a lesson with their parents and asked her daughter why she had not told her. When the girl heard about it, she was immediately worried, realizing that her mother could scold her now. Inu, stammering, said that she wasn't trying to hide it from her. It's just that they're always very busy, so she didn't want to ruin their mood as much. So, she just didn't say anything. Then suddenly her mom raised her voice at her and said that the girl was showing her indecisiveness again, and asked who said she should care if her mood or her wife's mood gets ruined. It's certainly not up to her. Inu didn't like it when her mother scolded and yelled at her like that, so she always kept her head down. But suddenly the woman came closer and asked her to look her in the eyes when she was talking. When she looked up, she saw that her mom wasn't so mean, and with a suspicious smile on her face, the woman asked her to think about it and tell her if she wanted her to come to her for this class or not. Inu was very surprised that her mom was asking such a question, so she didn't answer it right away. In fact, her mom hadn't smiled in a very long time, and now that she saw her smiling, she was a little surprised. Inu was very worried about it, clenched her hands in a fist and said that she really wished she could come to her for this lesson. The woman smiled even more and said, well, she can't not go to such an important lesson for her daughter after all. She turned around and started walking back to the kitchen, saying that they would see each other at school. Inu looked at her in surprise and couldn't believe that her mom had actually agreed to go to this class. The girl was ready to jump with happiness at the mere thought that her mom would come to school to look at her and support her, just like all the other parents. That's why Inu is going to try really hard to make sure she sees the teacher praising the girl for her progress, in which case her mom will be very proud of her daughter. She could already imagine the happy face of a mother when she hears the praise in her daughter's direction from the teacher, and thought that surely after such a thing she would surely come next time too. Inu was very excited at the possibility that now she could also be her mother's favorite daughter. The woman did attend the event. However, shortly after the lessons, when they went out to the yard and the mother picked up Yena from school, she told the girl with a slight smile on her face that she was very disappointed in her. Her voice was quite stern, and she said she thought her daughter was the smartest in the class, and she was incredibly embarrassed in front of the other parents when she saw what she saw. Inu looked at her mother in surprise, who didn't even deign to look her daughter in the eye. She said she had come to school to see her progress, but if she continued to be so unintelligent in class, she would never come again. Then she finally looked at her daughter and asked if she agreed with her opinion. Inu was very upset that she had not lived up to her mother's expectations and remained silent for a while. She held her mom's hand, and all she could think was that she incredibly wished she could come again and see her accomplishments. When the girl didn't say anything back, her mom suddenly smiled and leaned closer to her and apologized to her, saying she was just upset. She said she wanted to brag to all those parents that she had such a beautiful and smart daughter, but she was just sorry it didn't work out. The woman smiled and said that if Inu promised that she would do much better next time, she would definitely set aside more time and come to this open class to make sure. She looked her daughter in the eyes and smiled and asked her if she understood her. Inu smiled back and said that of course she understood and would make more effort. The woman stood up and said that she would step aside to talk to someone and asked that the girl in turn follow her sister. Inu, of course, agreed. They stepped back to the rest of the students who were waiting for their parents outside the school, and so anxiously asked how much longer they had to wait, since it had been quite a while since her mom had left. Inu looked at her little sister and said that she didn't know why her mom was late. They could see her across the street, and the girl wondered if they could just go up to her and ask. Big sister said they couldn't do that, because mom told them to expect her at this place, she would be done soon. So they didn't have much longer. At that moment the woman turned toward her daughters. She was on the phone and waved at them. Sue, when she saw this, she immediately ran to meet her without paying attention to anything. Gina immediately ran after her. She saw that the girl didn't obey, but the two of them ran out onto the road and didn't even notice that a truck was coming straight at them. The girl was very angry that her little sister did not listen to her all the time, and at that moment they did not have time to do anything, because the car was going fast enough, and they noticed it too late. That's why there was a strong impact. People who were standing around immediately started shouting and said that the children had been hit by a car and asked for an ambulance to be called immediately. Yena was lying there at this point, bleeding and feeling incredibly intense pain. She barely opened her eyes and could see her worried mother, who was hurting straight toward them. She wanted to tell her mother that she was in incredible pain, but she couldn't utter a word because of the severe blood loss. She really wished that her mom, at least in such a difficult situation, would finally take care of her just a little bit. And so, when the girl passed out, she dreamed of a terrible accident the whole time. When she opened her eyes after the accident, she found that she was in the hospital. Inu was still terrified after that dream. When she looked to the side, she saw a scary picture, namely her sister, who was hooked up to various machines that helped her breathe. She just sat there looking at her sister for a while, but then she exhaled with relief, because it could have ended worse, and so might not have survived, but she was alive. Inu sat on the bed and blamed herself for what had happened. After all, as the older sister, she was supposed to protect her at all costs. She cried and wiped away her tears, mentally apologizing to her sister, for it was all her fault for not being able to protect her and stop her in time. Here, after a while, the girl suddenly heard a familiar voice coming from the corridor. It was her mother. She was talking to her father and shouting, asking how she could be calm in such a situation. They stood outside the door, and the mom said they couldn't even pay the girl's hospital bills. The accident had left them completely penniless. Her father tried to calm her down, telling her that she needed to exhale a little, and he would try to resolve things as quickly as possible. But the woman wasn't going to calm down. She got even more angry and asked how he could even tell her to calm down in a situation like this. Sao was lying unconscious, hooked up to all the various machines that help her live, and she has to calm down. Her husband took her by the hand and told her to at least stop screaming, because it would wake up Jenu. But the woman was hysterical. She cried and said that if they didn't find the money, they would just end up on the street, and she didn't want to live like that again. The girl was silent for a while. Then she said that if Inu had watched her little sister as she should, this would not have happened. The girl stood under the door and listened to all this. She thought about the fact that if she hadn't asked her mom to come to school, the accident wouldn't have happened at all. If she hadn't been so selfish, So definitely wouldn't have gotten hurt and would be healthy now. And her mom wouldn't have had such a hard time.